This week on Quadriga, ethical economics, time for a new deal. Growth has become the mantra of the free markets. But as the gulf between the rich and poor continues to grow, more and more people are becoming alienated by what they see as cutthroat capitalism. In struggling economies, ordinary citizens are being asked to tighten their belts. How much inequality can society bear? Do we need a new economic system? Your host today, Ali Aslan.
Hello and welcome to Quadriga. There is a growing sentiment on a global scale that we can no longer continue to do business as usual. Some people are arguing that this economic system has led to a greater divide between the haves and have-nots. So, do we need a new economic system? And if so, what would the alternatives be? That and more we will discuss on today's show with my three guests. Welcome to Thomas Fricke, who is the chief economist of the Gruner & Jahr Wirtschaftsmedien Group. He has written many years for the Financial Times Deutschland. He also has his own internet blog named Wirtschaftswunder and has just published a book about the future of banking. Michael Levitin is a U.S. journalist who has written for the International Herald Tribune, the LA Times, and Time magazine. He is also a founder and editor of the Occupied Wall Street Journal. And Harriet Torrey is a reporter covering German politics and economics for Dow Jones Newswires. She has written about Germany for over 6 years from Berlin and Frankfurt. Welcome to you all. Thomas Fricke, it wasn't really that long ago that average people on the street, taxpayers, had to bail out banks with billions of dollars. Now we look at the headlines. The banks, such as JP Morgan, are raking in record profits once again. Bankers' salaries and bonuses are high once again. In hindsight, have we learned any lessons from the crisis?
I think people and politicians are trying to learn something about the crisis, but I'm afraid they didn't learn enough from that crisis, because in the first step, it's true we had to save the banks, because the banks are important to save the economy, to make the economy go. But then now we have to think about much more fundamentally about what role the banks should have and how big they should be and so on. And that's a very fundamental question. And we should change, to my mind, we should change radically how banks could go.
And how radically we have to change, we'll go into more detail in just a little bit. Michael Levitin, the people are angry on the street, not just the Occupy Wall Street movement. It was just one symptom of many. People had wanted to see bosses held to account and ensure that the crisis could not happen again. Would you say that the measures are implemented now to ensure that this crisis, in the form that we have seen, can no longer exist?
I would say that clearly it's not, because there are more rules being broken today and laws flouted, and CEOs and corporations essentially doing exactly what they want, as they did previously. I would say the laws, whether they've been put in place or not, haven't done things. You can look at the Dodd-Frank Act in America and Obama's efforts slowly to put more regulation in. But there are so many members in government themselves, and I think it goes for the whole planet. Governments are essentially now so influenced by the very economic actors who brought about the crisis, as in the various presidents and prime ministers in Europe who are essentially in Southern Europe, Goldman Sachs and banker-related politicians, that to regulate themselves is very difficult. So I wouldn't say that the regulations have really shown very effective. Unaccountability is still the name of the game.
And Harriet Torrey, untamed capitalism has always been associated with the United States, for instance. If we look at the numbers, even today, the top 1% of Americans control 40% of the nation's wealth. But the American way of life, if you will, is now slowly making its way into other parts of the world, including Europe as well, hasn't it?
Well, I think it's difficult to compare Europe and the US. They are very different systems in a way. Perhaps I think the area really to look at is Asia. That's definitely a rising player in the banking market. and also in terms of risks. That is true. I mean, in terms of the distribution of wealth, that is an issue in Europe, especially at the moment in light of the euro crisis. You see, there seems to be a divide forming between the north and the south, with extremely different economic situations. In the south, we have rampant unemployment, particularly for young people, and enormous social discontent. There is a debate over capitalism and what it's bringing to people in Europe. However, I do think that politicians are trying. There are steps being taken, it seems. For instance, Basel III. That's a step by Europe to try and encourage banks to try and make them their capital buffer higher in order to reduce risk. So the steps are being taken. That's the case.
And indeed, Thomas Frick, there are some steps taken. For instance, Switzerland has gone on to impose strict control on executive pay. The Swiss voted overwhelmingly in a referendum to do so. And the EU is deliberating whether to cap bonuses, bankers' bonuses as well. Do you think that's the right way to go?
I'm not sure, because that's running behind or being behind the curve a little bit and taking symptoms.
So too little, too late?
Yeah, it's a little bit too late, and just taking some very popular measures, and bonuses. It's a very good example, because the problem is not that they give bonuses. The problem is that they have so much money to give the bonuses. So just limit the bonuses will not change the system, will not change the fact that the banks have this huge money and it can create credit and debt and so on. And that's the fundamental point, and that's the risk that the policy is going to hit the symptoms and not really going to the fundamental problem to change the functioning of banks.
And indeed, Michael Leviton, Thomas Frick mentioned the word regulation. It used to be a dirty word in the financial system in the so-called Western world for a long time. Do you think though, that we need more regulation?
I think it's clear. We're living in an essentially libertarian model, if you want. I mean, we're libertarian. Corporations essentially run and manage and write the laws and manage their own policing of the laws because they're so influencing governments.
And how concrete would these regulations look like?
Regulations would actually put a value on communities and on the labor and on the environment that is being used to produce all the material that is creating this immense wealth for corporations. Businesses around the world use the public infrastructure, our roads, our trains, our waterways, our healthcare systems, our education, our technology, everything that is our training of our human systems, and yet they get extremely wealthy but do not pay taxes back into the system. They essentially live off of the bounty of what the society is producing, but then to not pay taxes back is an extreme flouting of the very system that sustains them. So when we look at corporate tax havens, and I'm sure we'll discuss more of that, it's quite striking, and that would be a form of regulation that should be absolutely enforced. You say 35% taxes, that means 35% taxes, not 12 or 15 like companies like Exxon and Pfizer and all these others, if they pay any at all.
And indeed, Harriet Torrey, in the so-called Western world, particularly the United States and Europe, we have taken free market for granted, haven't we? The term free market has been sort of a given in the spectrum, if you will, of economic dialogue. But aren't markets indeed shaped by laws and regulation, always have been? So is free market just a myth?
I don't quite know what you mean by free market being a myth. I mean, it's true that...
Meaning this rampant, untamed market, an untamed capitalism that people are often referring to. But haven't laws and regulations always been in place?
They have. There have been laws and regulations in place. That's definitely true. I mean, the point that you were just making about tax and offshore havens and things like that is definitely very much in the public eye at the moment, particularly after this offshore leak of documents. Nonetheless, under the current framework, well, tax evasion is illegal. Tax avoidance is not. I think that, in a way, it might be immoral, but it's not illegal. And so I think companies are controlled by their shareholders, and their wish is to create maximum value for shareholders. Therefore, I think they want to use the parameters of what they can do in order to maximize their profits.
But they've been doing this for decades. It's not like it's a new thing. We've had these tax havens. They've had decades to practice the art of evading regulations when needed. I mean, to only slap a company with a couple million or $100 million fine when they pollute the Gulf like BP, or when they rip off homeowners like they did in the banking crisis, that's a flouting of regulations. We say there are laws, they break the laws, but they don't get punished. There's two separate laws. Laws for people who go to jail when they commit crimes, and laws for banks and corporations who do not, who pay a small fee, don't even consider it an official crime, and it's wiped off. So in that sense, you can say regulations, that there have always been regulations, but who's enforcing them is the question that I think we need to ask. And what new strength do governments need in order to enforce these regulations when they're broken? Clearly in America, not one financial executive has gone to jail since taking down our economy and the global one. There's a problem.
And do you think that is shaking the belief of the people in the justice system?
Clearly. Our justice system is not serving the purpose of justice. There's a two-tier justice system. Everyone talks about it now. Justice for those with the money and the justice for the rest.
Would you agree, Thomas Fricke?
Yes, certainly. I would make the point that it could be worth looking in a historical perspective on all that. And if you look at how the banking system, how the financial system worked before, let's say, 1982, Reagan introduced a huge reform in the financial markets, and Margaret Thatcher followed him afterwards. The banking system was very simple before. That was the time of the boring banking. Banks couldn't give credit as they could afterwards. They couldn't do so much, create so much money and so on. And there was things like fixed exchange rates, heavy regulation on credit and so on. And if you look at that time, it was not so bad. I mean, Germany lived its Wirtschaftswunder at that time. The French had huge growth rates, even the United States, UK. If you compare the growth rates before and afterwards, the growth rates were higher before. This does not yet show that it's because of this financial system. But if bankers now tell us that they need all these derivatives and hedge funds and everything to finance this complicated world, I mean, the world was not so much less complicated in the sense that there was a huge structural shift in the economies. And look at Germany. Germany financed this Wirtschaftswunder with huge growth rates for years and years and years with simple credits and boring banking. They didn't need derivatives. They didn't need exchange rates in the foreign exchange markets, having billions of dollars each day and every day, which are going around the world. They didn't need it, and that at least shows that we should look a little bit more. We should not go back completely to that system, but it's interesting to look at that and to ask, do we really need all these things which banks tell us that they need in these days now?
So to separate investment banking from conventional banking is the first step that has to be taken, if I understand you correctly?
Yeah, that would be one step, but it's just one among many others. I mean, I'm a little skeptical on that point and that special point because we had a huge banking crisis in Japan. They have a separation of banks. So it does not really secure you. It's not a real guarantee to not have a financial crisis.
But that would be a first step that, for example, in Occupy Wall Street, one of the first profound sort of level ideas was restore the Glass-Steagall Act, which Bill Clinton eliminated in 1999, one of his final acts, which allowed commercial and investment banks, financial institutions to merge and began the unraveling. Citigroup was the first, and they all got into the game, but I think you're referring to the time before that process.
And since you mentioned Occupy Wall Street, when the crisis broke out and when taxpayers had to bail out the banks, there was a lot of anger, very immediate anger, camping out in front of Wall Street, even finding a lot of, if you will, imitators worldwide. Do you think that anger has somewhat fizzled to resignation?
Not resignation whatsoever, my gosh. If anything, it's become more desperate and perhaps more quiet in the sense that people are struggling everywhere to get by. I mean, the statistics of now that are coming out on these viral videos, 300 individuals in the world owning more than 3.5 billion people in the world. These statistics are seeping into to cultures everywhere, and I think austerity measures, which Europe is so obsessed about, and America, the idea that the burden should be placed on the backs of the people, cut Social Security, cut education, cut public transportation, cut things that weren't their fault to begin with if you actually paid, if corporations and big business paid back into the system that they're taking from, it would balance out. So why are people, I think that the frustration of Occupy Wall Street and the right side also, Tea Party, the Tea Partiers were the first ones that were so angry about the bailouts. I think that's not gone anywhere. In fact, we'll see in the elections, new parties are forming and new energies, new alliances building. People are going to have to create a new way.
And to Harriet Torrio, obviously that frustration can also be seen on the streets of Europe, particularly in the southern countries. You see it in Greece, you see it in Cyprus. What do you make of this? Do you think that's a danger at the end of the day, not just for those countries, but the EU in general?
The high unemployment, I think everyone in the EU agrees that is a major challenge. It's particularly amongst young people because you know, if you're young and out of a job, you're really missing out on key years. It's really awful. I mean, it's tragic for these people. So I think that is a key demand. But in order to create jobs, there needs to be growth. And there's an enormous debate within Europe. On the one hand, countries that promote austerity as a way of cutting spending, cutting pensions, cutting everything really, in order to get debt back down to sustainable levels. And get back on track, so to speak. And there are other proponents who say that actually that in this time, these countries shouldn't be cutting. They should be encouraging growth and encouraging people to spend and create jobs.
So is that the answer, though, growth? Is that as simple as that?
No, I mean, it's an ongoing experiment.
Yeah.
I mean, nobody really knows.
Isn't it something that even the more conservative and traditional economists believe, that we should, rather than austerity, be injecting funds? I mean, Paul Krugman has argued that for years, but even like folks at Dow Jones, I assume economists on a broad scale would say, rather than cutting, why aren't we producing the cash that we can in the future and put it as a... We're overproducing it now, but it's a matter of injecting, the government creating and injecting money into the economy rather than cutting it out. Is that something that would be supported?
That's a good question. I think, though, in Germany, the attitude is that the German economy, 10 years ago, was in a difficult situation. Unemployment was very high, and what the government did under Gerhard Schröder was to implement a program of reform whereby they cut welfare, and they really. They overhauled the social welfare system in order to try and get the economy competitive again. And as we've seen, Germany has emerged as the strongest country in the crisis. That it worked here, and I think that there's an attitude that this is what Europe needs to do as well.
I'm a little skeptical on that because it's a real important question. If the reforms of Schröder really explain the German situation now, that's something you always hear in Germany. But I mean, when Angela Merkel came to power in late 2005, the first thing she did was to stop reforms, because she realized at that time that people got rid of these reforms. I mean, at that time, as you said, Germany was in that situation. We had 5 million unemployed. We had years of restructuring, of structural reforms, and so on. And people they didn't want these reforms anymore. And Merkel realized that, and she stopped. And Merkel never did any big, I mean, there was 1 or 2 big reforms since, but she didn't. And when there was a crisis, like in 2009 and a big recession, she did that. She put the money in the economy. There was a huge stimulus program, but now she asked the others to do the opposite. I mean, that's not really fair. That's not really very, very smart to do that way. And so I think would be nice, good to look very precisely on what Germany did. And then say, what should the others do now?
But Germany, by and large, at least on a global scale, is still somewhat a country where the economic divergence, if you will, is still somewhat humane compared to some of the other countries, such as the U.S. as well. But look at what Nobel Prize economist Joseph Stiglitz is writing in his new book, The Price of Inequality. He does not just see anger growing, but he sees the danger that this unfairness is going to erode even democracy at the end of the day. Would you agree with him? Is it going to go as far as that we're going to even not just question the free market economic system, but democracy altogether?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at polls and when you ask people if they believe in that economic system, and there's a huge doubt now. And I don't know if it will be a huge problem at the end, but there are other problems arising from inequality. I mean, there were studies who told us that just especially the US and the UK, there were higher death rates in infant mortality and things like very many social aspects. Countries with a high inequality have more problems, more social, more health problems, and so on. And so this is a really a big problem, and it's even an economic problem. So even if it's not going to be a democratic problem, it's already an economic problem for these countries. And everyone's trying to get to go back and to reduce inequality. That's the big thing. I mean, when Margaret Thatcher started and Reagan started at that time, and for 20 years, inequality was always seen as something good, because it's for the incentives, and it gives incentives to the poor to get rich and so on. But now, I mean, everyone has already realized that was going too far.
I think you did hit it on the head, though, that an erosion in faith in the democratic principles that are supposed to protect societies from the ravages of an open free market. I think that now is pretty, we're safe to say that that's being felt all over Europe, Southern Europe for sure. The protests, Portugal, Spain, Greece, Italy now with its new five-star movement is a clear repudiation of the status quo government, and going all through Southern Europe, and I think quickly moving north. We're going to see.
But even to the extent that people are losing confidence in the political system?
In the system that is unable to rein in the power of finance. If finance is governing our system, essentially, the markets, everybody, the market, if our governments aren't strong enough to rein in the power of unbridled capitalism that is going to take and take and take until societies can't tolerate anymore and essentially strangle the life out of them. If the government isn't looking out for us, what is it serving?
And I know you've covered Latin America for a very long time, and we do see sort of democratic or rather political shake-up in countries, or we have seen in Venezuela and Bolivia, where a more leftist movement, if you will, arises and comes to power. Do you think we're going to see more and more the same in the Western world?
I think they led the way, in a sense, that the whole world has been quite attuned to the direction Latin America is in the last 10 to 12 years, really, with Brazil and Argentina as well, but especially with Correa in Ecuador, Evo Morales in Bolivia, the new Uruguayan president. Paraguay just had a coup. They're going the opposite direction, in part fueled by Monsanto and various corporate forces. But Venezuela, clearly they are showing a different direction, repudiating the neoliberal, open free market agenda that wrecked the continent over decades through the 70s, 80s, 90s, saying we are getting done with that. Washington, go your own way. We're going to actually bring back, kick out some of the companies and nationalize the oil fields, the copper mines, etc., and actually start possessing some of our own wealth. I think that's a trend that countries will pick up on.
Harriet Torrey, much is being made of the lack of morality, the increasing lack of morality on the part of the bankers. Would you agree? You've been covering economics for a very long time. Would you agree with that assessment that greed and lack of morality has taken over in the banking business and the finance sector?
I wouldn't make a sweeping statement like that. The public anger is palpable, that is true, and there has been much criticism of the way that banks have been managed in the past, particularly after 2008, when a number of banks had to take bailouts from the state. On the other hand, banks argue that they need to pay high salaries, and as you were saying, Thomas, that they have this money to distribute, and they need to pay high bonuses and high salaries in order to encourage talent and to compete with other economies, to compete with Asia, to compete with the US. So, yeah, it's a balance, between between not letting having public opinion on your side, and on the other hand, making having an economy that is competitive on the world stage.
And indeed, there is a widespread sense of unfairness all around the globe about current finances and the so-called offshore leaks, which have revealed that many individuals and companies have diverted taxes for many years with incredible sums, has only fueled and increased that anger. Let's have a quick look at what Offshore Leaks is all about.
There are huge profits to be made in the world of offshore finances. So much so that the world's leading banks, financial service companies, and even countries openly participate in the process. But where some profit, many governments are left with empty coffers to pay for aging populations and education. Estimates suggest EU countries lose about 1 trillion euros of income every year through tax avoidance. European finance ministers have now promised to tackle the issue. But while the move might enjoy popular support, it will be no small feat rewriting international tax laws and reining in the global offshore industry.
Well, Thomas Fricke, we just saw the Offshore Leaks that has broken a couple of weeks ago. Harriet Torrey said something very correct. It is perhaps amoral but not illegal to do so. Do you think that in and of itself is the core of the problem?
I mean, that's what I said. I think that's we have to look at a very much broader sense and at all that, because that's, I mean, if this industry, the banking industry, can make that money, I mean, that attracts people who are immoral. I mean, but I mean, that doesn't mean that the bankers in itself, they are more immoral than others. And I think that's a little bit. I'm a little bit skeptical if we get really to the point when we're just talking about these moral things. I mean, the fact is that for 20 or 30 years, the argument in politics, in economic policy, was we have to be careful about capital. We don't have to tax them, we have to be careful, we don't have to regulate them, and then all these tax avoidance things were just a little thing like, yeah, that's part of the competition. That's what was called tax competition. And everyone believed that it's good and sane to have low taxes on capital, to have a big, even more and more capital going around the world. And I think that the fundamental thing is that we have to check and look what did it mean for us, what did it bring, you know, and then we look at a huge number of crises. I mean, it's for all this time we had one crisis after the other. So I think the important thing is to reverse the thing, and in the discussion we have now about offshore leaks and things like that, we already realize that things and the minds change. The politicians realize that it's not good, because offshore leaks, this has been there for 20 years, 30 years. I mean, it's always been there, but nobody talked about it. You know, all these politicians knew it, but they thought, oh, look, it's part of the system, because capital has to be free. And now we have to realize that's not been a good idea, and we have to go back to a system which is much more controlled, and where laws who avoid these things that people can put their money anywhere in the world to avoid taxing.
Yeah,
jump in
on that. I mean, it's true that it's been like that for a while, but it's now reached a point of corporate profits have not been higher in 60 years, right? Even after the crash, corporations are making more. Corporate taxes have never been lower in 60 years. So we've reached a complete disparity in terms of how much they're making, how much they're paying back, and then they spend their time whining, saying, but if you tax us, we won't be able to start jobs. That is the biggest lie, and it's the lie that our governments have bought. Completely false. Tax them, make them pay, put that money back into our societies and our governments. It's absolutely a false premise of free market capitalism that to tax them is somehow going to prevent them from exercising their full, profit-making capacities. On the contrary, will make them compete and fight and not look for so many ways to swindle and evade paying what everyone should be paying.
Well, yeah. The thing is, you both talked about laws, but I think in cases like this, we live in an increasingly globalized world, and it's very difficult for countries for laws to come about that control these kinds of things. I mean, this is Germany and its neighbour Switzerland have long clashed over this issue of tax evasion via bank accounts in Switzerland, and how can the German government control that without Switzerland agreeing to some kind of deal. I mean, these countries have to submit to conventions in order to impose any kind of laws. I mean, we've been talking about tax havens, and the tax havens have to voluntarily agree to not be tax havens in order to not be tax havens. So this is outside of national boundaries, and you need supernatural authority in order to control things like this, which countries have to agree to willingly. And I agree, yes, I can understand, it is a big problem. And for countries, and they have spoken out against this. I think in February or March, the finance ministers of Germany, France, and Britain came together to talk about this phenomenon called profit shifting, whereby a company earns its money in one country and then declares the profits in a different country where corporate taxes might be lower. So it declares lower, it wins out in that way. But in order to impose these kind of rules, there needs to be agreement between states. And then it comes to diplomatic issues. For instance, German tax authorities in different states, like in North Rhine-Westphalia, this has happened. It happened this week in Rhineland-Palatinate. They buy CDs of tax data from someone who has access to this data, and by doing that, they can find tax evaders in their country, but it creates difficulties, diplomatic difficulties between the countries, and Switzerland argues that this is the purchase of stolen goods and data protection.
Right.
So I think that is also something that needs to be agreed to.
I would say that I wouldn't be too skeptical about that, because for 20 years the argument went like we cannot raise taxes because the others don't do. And that was, everyone said that they can't do it because the others don't do, and because capital will fly away and so on. And I think this consensus, this very simple thing, has broken already. It's not yet the other consensus. The consensus is not yet that we have to tax it again. But if you look at Germany and the financial transaction tax, for example, 5 years ago, this was an idea which was in the heads of some very extreme people, and now it's defended by the Merkel coalition, by a conservative government. So I'm a little bit optimistic about the question that the moods can change and humanity perhaps will progress a little bit more. Immediately it's a problem, but I think if we go some years further, and the people will realize that it's a real problem. And at least now we discuss offshore leaks, and that's.
If half of the Fortune 500 companies aren't even paying half of the required tax of 35%, and declaring losses in those countries, as you say, they shift it and declare a loss, and then we subsidize them. Exxon, Bank of America, Citigroup, from defense to pharmaceuticals to telecommunications, the Verizons of the world, all declaring losses and demanding subsidies where they should be paying billions, as you say, along with financial transaction tax that would lift up our economies immensely.
Michael Leviton, let me play devil's advocate here for a second, because we've been talking a lot about social inequality today, and it's very much centered around that debate in the public sphere. But hasn't there always been inequality at the end of the day? Even the so-called communist Soviet Union was not able to if you will, put everyone on the same level. Isn't that the case? Don't we have to live with a certain degree of inequality in this world?
I think that's definitely. You will have to, no matter what. No system has been designed or defined that could avoid that. And America overall would say that that's part of what the capitalist do-it-yourself ethos is. Some people make it, some don't. I think that's not what people are so angry about as the degree. And it's the level, how quickly it crept up. We weren't quite paying attention. The 90s, the big internet era, the boom, we somehow seemed to have expansion. And then with the Bush years, at least from the American perspective, draining the economy, 2 wars, draining the economy, the housing bubble and crisis, all gambled away. $20 trillion just gone overnight, thanks to a lot of derivatives trading and people not being watched over. The unaccountability combined with a new level, a staggering inequality. So people not being punished for committing crimes that have hurt vast numbers of people. I think that's the disparity. We're seeing a lot of suffering. All these families go underwater, can't pay their medical bills, can't pay health, can't send kids to school. Real human suffering combined with a level of wealth not seen ever before, 400 Americans owning more than 150 or 180 million Americans. Outrageous, right? Anyone would say it, even the wealthy. They say it themselves. Warren Buffett, tax me, he says it. Everybody is recognizing it. It's become outrageous. It isn't that there's inequality, it's the degree.
And Harriet Torrey, one newly formed party in Germany is actually trying to tap in that frustration, even though it might be of a different nature. Here in Germany, an anti-Euro party has just recently been formed. What do you make of this?
The Alternative for Deutschland, yes, that is definitely a new phenomenon, and it has come on the scene very recently, and it seems to have really quickly gained traction. I think there was a poll on Sunday suggesting that were there a vote now, that the Alternative for Deutschland, the Alternative Party, would take 3%, which is, I think, a big, for a new party. And the core of their manifesto is that they want Germany to exit the euro. They want to have sovereignty back on the German currency and on the way that German money is spent. It's definitely a very interesting and new phenomenon in this country, particularly where the rhetoric sometimes against Southern Europe can be harsh. There are stereotypes in the media of Germans being hardworking, paying their taxes, and Southern Europeans having kind of taken their eye off the ball, enjoyed easy credit after the euro was introduced, and not taking care of their public finances and overspending, housing bubble. So I think this party, which is new, as I said, is starting to tap into that feeling.
And Thomas Fricke, much has been made about the frustration on the part of the people in Spain, in Greece, Portugal, and Cyprus. Are we overlooking the frustration and anger here in Germany sometimes?
I'm not so sure, because the polls show that that's an important figure to have 3%, but 3% is not yet enough to get into the Bundestag. It will be a problem if they get into the Bundestag, but there are always polls telling us that about 70% of Germans couldn't even imagine to vote for a party which is against the euro. So I'm a little skeptical if the potential for such a group is so big. And I hope so, because there's a big illusion behind all these criticism in Germany about the euro and so on. That's a real illusion. I mean, that's saying that Germany would be fine without the euro. I mean, that's not the problem. The problem is Germany also had to pay 20% of its GDP to rescue banks. That didn't have anything to do with the euro. The German economy and the German finance system has always been also been in a problem. So the fundamental problem is the financial globalization. That's not the euro, and that's, I mean, the big risk that there's something. People are getting nationalist and thinking that everything would be better if they got back the Deutschmark and whatever. That's a real risk, I think.
And Thomas Fricke, if we accept the premise that our current economic system is flawed and needs to be repaired, how would this new so-called New Deal, new economic system look like? What would you propose?
I would be quite radical on that's a little technical thing.
Please be radical.
That's I think that the growing consensus to ask banks to have capital requirements of 20 to 25%, so which would mean that they have to finance themselves very much more if they get credit and give credit. So that's something they will cry that will be the end of the world. But I think it's a growing consensus to ask banks to have a capital requirement of 20-25%, something like that. This will avoid very much of this creating money things, and so I would go far, and it seems a little bit perhaps illusionary, but I would really look at the afterwar period, and we had fixed exchange rates, and this, when it worked, it didn't work so bad. I mean, there were some things we could do better than at that time. We could learn from the experience, but this was for firms and for people. It was much better environment to calculate, to think, and so I think these are things which are quite radical, but which would help to go back to a very much more stable financial system, and to take the priority to the real economy and not to the financial one as we had in the last few years.
Michael Leviton, what would your blueprint look like?
I mean, I think that's a lot of specifics. I would say just the bigger picture is putting the decision-making power actually back towards the people. And I think that Southern Europe, in its waves of protests is demanding that. And you say whether Germany is ignoring that, I think a lot of people are ignoring. That's a explosion waiting to happen. The entire southern part of the continent is essentially not making it right now. And there aren't any solutions on hand. I think that putting power and letting communities build, putting money back, letting people reinvest and rebuild physically our infrastructure, at least from the American perspective, that's the way to do it.
Harriet Torrey, do we need a new economic system? And if so, what would you say? How would it need to look like?
I think I go back to the point that I made before about global governance, the fact that it's very difficult to impose rules for everybody on a global scale because everybody has to agree to them. Yes, in Europe we can force banks to hold more capital and try and reduce that risk that way, but risk will still exist in other countries. And in an increasingly globalized world, are we going to be separate from that risk? It's a big question.
So we have to live with these fluctuations and insecurities? Is that what it is at the end of the day, Thomas Fricke? We just have to live with the imperfect?
No, I think it takes time. It takes time to build a new system. I mean, the New Deal has been a real big step at that time, and it took a lot of years afterwards to implement it. And I think we're in the midst of a paradigm shift. And so we shouldn't expect that things change completely tomorrow. But we're going in that direction. As I said, the financial transaction tax was an illusion some years ago. Now there are big countries in Europe, at least, who implement it. So let's wait and see. In some years, perhaps the UK, the US will follow. I'm a little bit optimistic about that.
Well, on that positive note, we need a paradigm shift, or at least we are already on the path of a paradigm shift, says Thomas Fricke. We will see where the shift is headed and what exactly at the end of the day will come out of it. I want to thank my guests for sharing their insights into this very important subject matter. And we will continue, of course, to cover this story for the days, months, and years ahead. Thank you very much out there for tuning in, and hope to see you again next week for a new edition of Quadriga.